I've been lurking on this sub for a while, reading other people's confessions, and I guess it's finally my turn. I'm William, and this is one of those stories I don't usually tell out loud because once you say it, you have to admit you're the kind of person who crossed a line and didn't immediately run back. For me, that line was forging a driver's license. It sounds small when you say it fast, almost childish, like shoplifting candy. At the time, I even convinced myself it was basically harmless. Just paper and plastic, right? No one bleeding, no one screaming. The truth is, it came out of a mix of impatience and entitlement. I was stuck in that in between stage of life where everyone around me seemed to be moving forward jobs, independence, freedom, while I was stalled out by rules and timelines. I needed a license for work, for respect, for the ability to stop asking other people for rides like a kid. Waiting felt unbearable, and I started telling myself that the system was slow, unfair, and honestly kind of stupid. That's the story I fed myself until breaking the law felt less like a crime and more like correcting an inconvenience. Looking back now, that's the part that scares me the most. Not the act itself, but how easy it was to justify it. I didn't wake up thinking, today I'll become a criminal. I woke up thinking, I deserve this. And once that thought settles in, it opens a door that's hard to close again. Once the idea took root, it didn't feel reckless anymore. It felt inevitable. I didn't jump straight into action. There was this quiet incubation period where I just thought about it constantly, turning it over in my head like a coin. Every time I saw someone flash their license, without a second thought, it made my chest tighten. That little rectangle represented freedom, adulthood, credibility. I wanted all of that, and I wanted it now. Preparation for me was less about tools and more about mindset. I spent days talking myself into believing I was capable of pulling it off. I told myself I was careful, detail oriented, smarter than the average screw up who gets caught. I rehearsed explanations in my head for situations that hadn't even happened yet. If someone questioned me, I'd act calm. If something looked off, I'd play dumb. I convinced myself confidence was the real key, not authenticity. I also took mental notes about how official things looked and felt. Fonts, colors, the way authority tends to be subtle but firm. I didn't think of it as studying a crime. I framed it as research, which is a word that makes bad decisions feel academic instead of illegal. The more I planned, the less nervous I became, and that scared me even then. Fear should have stopped me. Instead, preparation smoothed it out, sanding down my doubts until all that was left was anticipation. By the time I told myself I was ready, it didn't feel like I was about to do something wrong. It felt like I was about to take control, and that, in hindsight, was the most dangerous lie I told myself. Here's where I want to be careful, because even back then, I told myself I had rules. I wasn't going to become some master criminal. I wasn't running a ring or selling anything. This was one time, just for me. That distinction mattered a lot in my head. It was how I slept at night. I kept telling myself there was a difference between using the system and abusing it, even though deep down, I knew that was just wordplay. Most of my preparation happened quietly and alone, late nights, screens glowing, my heart doing that slow, nervous thump that only shows up when you know you're skirting something forbidden. I double-checked everything, not in a technical sense, but in a does this feel believable way. I practiced being casual in the mirror, holding my face neutral, relaxed. I worked on the version of myself I wanted other people to see. Unremarkable, forgettable, legitimate. What surprised me was how personal it started to feel. This wasn't just about getting a license anymore. It was about proving something to myself, that I could bend reality just a little and not have it snap back. I remember thinking, if I pull this off, it means I'm not powerless. That thought was intoxicating, way more than the document itself. There was also this strange calm that settled in right before I went through with it, like my brain had already accepted the outcome, and skipped ahead to life afterward. No alarms, no dramatic music, just a quiet resolve. That should have been a warning sign. Instead, I took it as confidence. The day I finally committed to it didn't feel dramatic. No storm clouds, no cinematic tension. It was almost boring, which somehow made it worse. I remember sitting there thinking, this is it? This is the point of no return? I'd always imagined crime coming with this big, obvious shift, like flipping a switch. Instead, it was more like drifting over a line you didn't notice until you were already on the other side. I kept running through my mental checklist, not of actions, but of behavior. Don't rush, don't oversell it. Act like this is normal because, for everyone else, it is. I told myself that people who get caught are the ones who look guilty, and I was determined not to look like anything at all. Just another face, another name, another person passing through someone else's workday. There was a moment where my hands hesitated, just slightly. My pulse picked up and I felt that tightness in my throat that comes right before panic. I almost walked away. I actually remember thinking, you can still stop. No one would ever know. But that thought was immediately followed by another, louder one. If you stop now, you'll always wonder if you could have done it. That curiosity, that need to know, pushed me forward more than any practical need ever did. Once I crossed that threshold, time started moving weirdly. Too fast and too slow at the same time. Every small interaction felt magnified, like it carried the weight of my entire future. I became hyper-aware of my surroundings, other people's voices, their expressions. I was waiting for something to go wrong, convinced I'd recognize the exact second everything unraveled. Once things were in motion, I realized I wasn't just committing a crime. I was performing. Every word out of my mouth felt scripted, every movement deliberate. I leaned hard into this version of myself I'd rehearsed. Relaxed shoulders, neutral expression, mild impatience like I'd done this 100 times before. I kept reminding myself that confidence sells normalcy. If I acted like I belonged there, maybe no one would look twice. What I didn't expect was how intensely I'd read other people. A raised eyebrow felt like an accusation. A pause in conversation felt like a trapdoor opening beneath me. I started projecting my own guilt onto everyone around me, assuming they could somehow sense what I was hiding. In reality, they were probably thinking about lunch or the end of their shift. But when you're the one lying, you assume everyone else is a detective. There were small hiccups, nothing obvious, just those tiny delays that make your heart stutter. A question asked twice, a glance that lingered half a second too long. Each one sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I remember feeling heat rush to my face and having to consciously slow my breathing, terrified that I was about to give myself away by reacting too much. And yet nothing exploded. No alarms, no sudden confrontation. The world just kept moving, indifferent to my internal meltdown. That was the strangest part, realizing that something I'd built up as life-altering could unfold in such an ordinary setting. It made the whole thing feel surreal, like I was watching myself from the outside, wondering how I'd ended up playing this part so convincingly. Just when I started to believe I might actually get through it, something shifted. Not a dramatic accusation, but a subtle change in tone. Someone looked at the license again, longer this time. That pause stretched out in my head until it felt like minutes. My stomach dropped, and all the confidence I'd carefully stacked up threatened to collapse at once. I remember thinking, this is it. This is where it ends. My brain started racing ahead to consequences, being pulled aside, questions I couldn't answer, that humiliating phone call I'd have to make afterward. I tried to prepare my face for that outcome, to look confused rather than guilty, but inside I was already unraveling. My mouth went dry. My hands felt too heavy, too noticeable. What messed with me most was how polite everyone still was. No raised voices, no suspicion made explicit, Just normal human interaction layered over my internal panic. It felt almost cruel. I kept waiting for the hammer to drop, for someone to say the words that would officially label me as what I was pretending not to be. Then the moment passed. The license was handed back. The conversation moved on. No explanation. No drama. I nodded, muttered something that sounded like thanks, and walked away on legs that didn't quite feel like they belonged to me. It wasn't relief I felt at first. It was disbelief, like I just stepped off a ledge and realized I was still standing. I didn't feel victorious walking away. I felt hollow, like all that tension had been holding me together, and once it released, there was nothing solid underneath. My body was buzzing, hands trembling just enough that I shoved them into my pocket so no one would notice. I kept replaying the interaction in my head, frame by frame, searching for signs I'd missed. Some clue that this wasn't actually over yet. Every sound felt louder than it should have been. Every laugh from someone nearby made me flinch, convinced it was somehow about me. I half expected someone to call out my name, to tap me on the shoulder and say there'd been a mistake. I walked faster than usual, not running, but not casual either, stuck in this awkward in-between that probably screamed nervous energy. What surprised me most was the guilt creeping in alongside the adrenaline. I'd spent so long justifying the act that I hadn't prepared for the emotional hangover. Now that it was done, I couldn't hide behind planning or research anymore. I'd actually done it. That realization sat heavy in my chest like I'd swallowed something sharp. And yet, this is the part I'm not proud of. There was also a quiet thrill humming beneath the fear. I hated that it was there. Hated how my brain tried to spin the whole thing as a success story. I remember thinking, if I got away with this once, and immediately shutting that thought down, terrified of what it said about me. The days after were worse in a quieter way. There was no dramatic fallout, no immediate punishment, just the slow realization that I was now carrying something around with me that no one else could see. Every time I reached for my wallet, my chest tightened. That little card felt heavier than it should have, like it was pressing a thumb into my conscience. I started overthinking everything. If I got pulled over, would I sound normal? If someone glanced at it too long, would they notice something I'd somehow missed? I caught myself practicing explanations in my head again, even when there was no reason to. And it was exhausting, living in this constant low-level alert, like my nervous system never fully powered down. What really got to me was how normal life kept going. Friends joked around. Coworkers complained about dumb stuff. Strangers held doors open. No one treated me like I'd crossed a moral boundary because, to them, I hadn't. That disconnect messed with me. It made me feel both invisible and exposed at the same time. I'd look at people and wonder how many of them were carrying their own secrets, and whether I'd just joined some silent club of people, pretending to be cleaner than they really are. I also noticed something uncomfortable about myself, how quickly the fear started to fade. Not disappear, but dull. The longer nothing happened, the easier it became to tell myself it was over, that it didn't matter anymore. That scared me more than the panic ever did because it meant I was adapting to the lie. Just when I started to believe the anxiety was something I could live with, life decided to poke the bruise. I got pulled over. Nothing dramatic, just a routine stop. But the moment I saw the lights, my heart slammed so hard it felt like it might actually hurt. All those rehearsed scenarios I'd tried to forget came rushing back at once. I remember sitting there, hands on the wheel, telling myself not to overreact. People get pulled over every day. This is normal. But nothing felt normal. When the officer asked for my license, my fingers hesitated for half a second too long before reaching for my wallet. That pause felt like a confession all on its own. I was acutely aware of every movement, every breath, terrified that my body was betraying me. The interaction itself was brief, polite, professional, way too calm for the storm happening inside my head. I stared straight ahead, answering questions in what I hoped was a steady voice, while my thoughts spiraled. I kept thinking about how fragile my whole situation was, how one extra glance, one different mood, one minor detail could unravel everything. When I was waved off with a warning, relief washed over me so hard it made me dizzy. But it wasn't the good kind of relief. It was the kind that leaves you shaken, aware of how close you just came to something irreversible. Driving away, my hands were shaking again, and all I could think was, I can't keep doing this to myself. That was the first time I seriously wondered whether getting away with it was actually worse than getting caught. After that close call, I went through a phase of intense rationalization. I told myself the worst was behind me, that the fear I felt was proof I wasn't some hardened criminal. Bad people don't feel this bad, I thought. I clung to that idea like it absolved me somehow, like guilt itself was a form of repayment. I also started reframing the whole thing as survival instead of deception. I needed to get places, I needed to function. I wasn't hurting anyone directly. These were the arguments I repeated whenever the unease bubbled up. They sounded convincing in the quiet of my own head, but they fell apart the moment I tried to imagine explaining them out loud to someone I respected. There was a constant internal tug of war. One part of me wanted to bury the memory and move on, treat it like a dumb mistake that happened to work out. Another part wouldn't let it go, replaying every moment where things could have gone differently. I'd lie awake at night thinking about how thin the margin was between nothing happened and everything changed. What really messed with me was realizing how adaptable I was. The same brain that panicked during the stop was now calmly constructing stories to protect my self-image. That realization hit hard. It forced me to see that the crime itself wasn't the only problem. The way I bent my values afterward was just as unsettling. Over time, the justifications started to wear thin. They still showed up automatically, but they didn't land the same way. I'd hear myself thinking, you had to do it, and immediately feel that dull pushback in my chest. Not outrage, not panic, just this steady sense that I was lying to myself, and worse, that I knew it. What triggered it wasn't anything dramatic. It was small stuff. Filling out forms, casual conversations about driving tests or waiting periods. I'd nod along, maybe even joke, while feeling like I was standing slightly off from the version of myself everyone else saw. I wasn't exactly afraid of being exposed anymore. I was uncomfortable with being unseen. With the gap between who I was and who I appeared to be, I noticed I started avoiding certain topics, steering conversations away without really meaning to. It made me quieter, more guarded. I didn't like that. I'd always thought of myself as straightforward, someone who could own his mistakes. Carrying this secret chipped away at that self-image in a way I hadn't anticipated. There was also this lingering sense of waiting, not for punishment necessarily, but for closure, like a part of me was still bracing for an ending that never came, and without that ending, the story just stayed open, hanging there, unfinished, asking what kind of person I was becoming. By letting it fade into the background, the strangest realization hit me months later. Getting away with it didn't feel like freedom anymore. It felt like weight. There was no dramatic release, no moment where I could say, okay, it's over. Instead, the absence of consequences became its own kind of consequence. I carried this quiet knowledge that I'd crossed a line and the universe hadn't pushed back. I started to notice how that changed the way I saw myself. Not in a loud self-loathing way, but in subtler moments. When I judged other people for cutting corners, a voice in my head would remind me to sit down and shut up. When I thought about rules, I no longer saw them as abstract guidelines. I saw them as things you could break and live with. That perspective shift unsettled me more than fear ever had. There was also a dull sense of disappointment I didn't expect. I'd built the whole thing up as this pivotal act, something that would unlock a new phase of my life. But once the adrenaline faded, it was just life again. Same problems, same insecurities, now with an extra layer of dishonesty woven in. The crime didn't fix anything about me, it just changed how I carried myself through the world. That's when it finally clicked that this story wasn't about a license at all. It was about how easy it is to compromise yourself quietly, without sirens or handcuffs, and how hard it is to notice the change until you're already living with it. At some point, the story stopped being about how smart I thought I was. That edge, the sense that I'd outmaneuvered something bigger than me, just dulled out. What replaced it was a quiet embarrassment I didn't know what to do with. Not the kind you confess and laugh about later, but the kind that sits in your gut when you realize you're not who you thought you were. I started noticing how often I'd almost bring it up, then swallow the words. Not because I wanted credit, but because I wanted absolution. I wanted someone to tell me I wasn't a bad person, that this one thing didn't define me. But I also knew that putting it out there would mean owning it fully, without the safety of internal excuses. So I kept it to myself and let it shape me in silence. The irony is that nothing external forced this shift. No threat, no investigation, no looming consequence. It was internal pressure, building slowly. I'd catch my reflection in mirrors or windows and feel like I was looking at someone who'd learned the wrong lesson and was still trying to unlearn it. Someone who thought bending the rules would make him bigger, only to realize it just made him smaller in ways that were hard to measure. That was when I understood something uncomfortable. The real cost of what I did wasn't legal or even practical. It was personal. It was the loss of a certain kind of self-respect. The kind that's easy to take for granted until you realize you traded it away for convenience. I didn't wake up one day redeemed or resolved. It was more like a slow, deliberate editing process in my head, rewriting the story I'd been telling myself about who I was. For a long time, I'd framed the whole thing as a clever detour, a necessary shortcut. Now it felt more accurate to call it what it was, a choice I made because I didn't want to sit with discomfort. That realization didn't come with relief. It came with responsibility. I had to admit that no one forced my hand. No system singled me out unfairly enough to justify what I did. I chose the easier path because it was easier. And once I stripped away all the rationalizations, that truth was uncomfortably plain. I started paying attention to how I handled smaller decisions after that, not in some dramatic, saintly way, but in quiet moments where cutting a corner would have been convenient. Every time I stopped myself, it felt connected to this old mistake, like I was trying to rebalance something I'd tipped over. I couldn't undo what I'd done, but I could refuse to let it quietly define how I moved forward. What stuck with me most was the awareness that identity isn't some fixed label, it's an accumulation. One choice doesn't damn you, but it does nudge you in a direction. Realizing that made me more cautious, not just about rules, but about the stories I tell myself to justify crossing them. So that's where this story lands. I didn't get caught. No dramatic fallout. No lesson delivered by flashing lights or a judge's voice. And that's exactly why I'm writing this here, instead of pretending it never happened. Getting away with it taught me something I wouldn't have learned otherwise. The absence of consequences doesn't mean the absence of cost. If you're reading this and thinking about doing something similar, telling yourself it's minor, temporary, justified, I won't preach or threaten you with worst-case scenarios. I'll just say this. Be honest about what you're really trading. It's rarely just about the rule you're breaking. It's about the version of yourself you're willing to quietly edit to make it feel okay. I learned that shortcuts don't actually shorten the journey. They just change what you carry with you along the way. In my case, it was a low-grade anxiety, a dent in my self-respect, and the uncomfortable knowledge that I'd chosen convenience over integrity when no one was watching. That stuff lingers longer than the thrill ever does. I don't see myself as a villain, but I don't give myself a pass either. This was one of those moments that forced me to look closely at who I was becoming and decide consciously to course correct. If there's any warning here, it's this. The most dangerous lies are the ones that sound reasonable in your own head. Catch them early. They're easier to deal with before they turn into stories like mine.